All right, let's try now to cross to Beirut. Jasmine El Gamal, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, former Syria advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense, where I guess you could say you had front row seats to the unwinding of Syria throughout these past 7 years. Thank you for speaking with us on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, your reaction to these tit-for-tat resolutions and your thoughts on Russia and Syria, on the government in Damascus, inviting in that UN chemical weapons inspection watchdog.
I think it's a very interesting development, to tell you the truth. I didn't really expect the Russians to go ahead and invite weapons inspectors in. That to me tells me that they might be trying to delay a U.S. response or any sort of international response until they figure out what their counter response would be, or the fact that maybe what they're saying is true and maybe the attacks either were not perpetrated by the Assad regime or there were no such chemical attacks whatsoever. That seems to me really unlikely. So the only thing that I can think of now is that it's a delay tactic until they figure out what they would do in case of an international strike.
A delay tactic, but Donald Trump has given himself a self-imposed 24 to 48 hour timeline. As Douglas Herbert was just saying a moment ago, that does not leave him a huge amount of room to maneuver.
No, it doesn't. But at the same time, as far as I know, and just speaking to former colleagues in the administration, we have not yet been able to prove 100% that these chemical attacks were in fact perpetrated by the Assad regime. We don't know as much as we'd like to. And so given that the Russians have agreed to allow inspectors in, I would find it quite unusual for the Trump administration to do anything such as an attack, anything really kinetic on the ground right now, without having undisputed proof that this was something that actually happened and that we know who the perpetrators were.
Yeah, quick question. Given the fact that those inspectors are apparently headed to Duma at Russia and the Syrian government's invitation, if they were to find that the Syrian government and the regime were responsible for the use of chemical weapons, do you see Russia and Syria accepting those conclusions?
I think it doesn't matter at that point whether or not they accept the conclusions. They've invited independent investigators to come in and investigate the conditions on the ground. Whether those investigations and the results are accepted by the Russians and Syrians is actually irrelevant at that point, because what we would need as the United States, what France would need, what the international community that has said they would act would need, is an independent verification of those results. And so at that point, I really don't see the Russian position having much to do with it. I think that what we would need to have is independent verification before striking. And that is if the president decides to wait.
What do you make of Donald Trump's Syria strategy? He was hinting at a pullout, more than hinting at it, talking about it openly just a week ago. Now he's calling Assad an animal. He's got a new national security advisor who's very hawkish, John Bolton. Is he the right man to lead the United States in this particular crisis?
I think you raise such an important point. It's such an important question. What is Donald Trump's strategy in Syria? I would argue that there is no strategy, and there has been no strategy in Syria since he took office. When I used to work at the Department of Defense, and I was actually there when the first red line incident occurred, when President Obama declared a red line after which the Assad regime used chemical weapons. And so I was involved in the preparation of options to respond to the use of chemical weapons. And one thing that I can tell you that Department of Defense advisors and personnel are doing right now when they're told to conduct or to put together military options to respond to the strike, the first question they ask is, to what end? Because that will help us figure out and that will help us advise you to the best of our ability. What are you trying to do in Syria? What is the strategy? As we saw last year, we had a very powerful response to chemical weapons use. And it really didn't do anything, because here we are just a year later with another incident of chemical weapons use. And so one could argue that these one-off strikes that don't seem to be part of any broader strategy are incredibly ineffective. And so to do that again, I think would be a huge mistake, which is why I would actually caution the president and the French president, for that matter, who seems very eager to initiate some kind of response as well, to wait until they know what the strategy is. What are they trying to accomplish with these strikes? Is it just to get Assad to stop using chemical weapons, or is it to stop getting him to perpetrate war crimes and crimes against humanity, or is it to challenge the Russians territorially? There are so many issues related to Syria, and it's very unclear at this point exactly what President Trump sees as a short and long-term strategy in that country.
Jasmine El Gamal of the Atlantic Council, so many thanks for speaking with us from Beirut.